My name is Margaret Hayes, though most people around town still call me Maggie. I spent 36 years keeping the books at a small hardware store, 42 years being Jim's wife, and every single day being somebody's mother. That morning, I sat at a long, polished table in a lawyer's office, listening while my daughter leaned forward in her blazer and told the attorney, "She doesn't understand anything." The words landed hard, sharper than if she had slapped my hand away from a hot stove. I felt my chest tighten, then my jaw. The attorney, a young man with neat hair and a pen already poised, glanced at me with the kind of pity I had started to recognize lately, the pity reserved for people who had supposedly drifted past their usefulness. I placed my hand flat on the table. "I understand perfectly," I said. My voice, even though my pulse rattled, strike that clause. The attorney hesitated, blinking at me as if I had spoken a foreign language. Linda crossed her arms, the way she used to when she was 15 and wanted curfew extended. "Mom, this is for your own good." I remembered driving her to softball practice, her ponytail swinging, her chin tilted with that same defiance. I remembered the nights I stayed up balancing the checkbook so the lights would stay on. I remembered burying Jim and paying every bill myself after. My mind wasn't gone. My memory wasn't broken. What was broken was the respect I thought my daughter still held for me. I leaned toward the attorney. "If your draft calls me incompetent, it's a lie. I pay my bills. I remember my neighbors' birthdays. I know who I am." The smell of coffee, burnt at the bottom of the pot, filled the silence. The attorney reached for a new document. Linda let out a long sigh through her nose, the same barn door sound from her teenage years. I kept my eyes on the paper so she wouldn't see the tremor in my hand. I was not confused, I was insulted, and I was done pretending not to notice. I walked out of Whitmore and Klein with the afternoon sun blazing down like a spotlight and drove the long way home past the reservoir. The water shimmered, throwing back lights so bright it made me squint. At the next red light, I caught my own reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman staring back at me had strong posture, steady eyes, and lipstick a little bolder than I usually dared for a weekday. Jim would have teased me, said it looked like I was going to a dance. The thought made my chest ache, but I smiled anyway. The porch boards creaked under my shoes when I climbed the steps, just as they had for decades. Inside, I set my purse on its hook, turned the kettle on, and pulled Jim's old leather notebook from the shelf. It still smelled faintly of tobacco and pencil lead. At the kitchen table, I opened to a clean page and wrote the word inventory. Below it, I listed the power company, water bill, insurance, property taxes, each one with a square box beside it. The kettle began to whistle, and I poured the water over a bag of black tea, letting the steam rise against my face. I kept writing, bank, attorney, and then, after a pause, garden. Because while the lilacs couldn't keep the lights on, they kept me breathing steady when nothing else did. Outside the window, a squirrel dashed along the fence rail as if late for a meeting. I tapped my pen and thought about Linda's words. "For your own good." That phrase clung to me like smoke. I drew a new heading, boundaries. I underlined it twice, hard enough to press grooves into the paper. The phone rang, sharp against the quiet. Mrs. Alvarez from down the street wanted to know how my tomatoes were doing this season. We talked for exactly 7 minutes. I know because I watched the second-hand circle twice. When I hung up, I checked 2 boxes on my list and sat back. The kitchen smelled of tea and lemon oil, familiar and grounding. My hands rested on the notebook. I knew then that lists were not enough. If I wanted to keep my life from being folded into someone else's plan, I would have to act, and soon. Saturday came with a bright sky and the smell of cut grass. the kind that clings to the air in early summer. I drove to Linda's house for the family brunch she had arranged. The neighborhood was all sharp hedges and manicured lawns, driveways filled with gleaming SUVs. Through the front window, I caught sight of a white frosted cake perched on a stand in the dining room, the kind of centerpiece you'd see in a magazine. Paul opened the door before I could ring the bell. His smile looked wide but hollow, like a salesman's grin. "We're so glad you're here, Maggie," he said, as though greeting a client instead of his wife's mother. Linda hugged me lightly, her shoulder bones stiff as fence posts. "We've been thinking," she began before I had even set my purse down. "It's time to be practical. You shouldn't have to worry about finances or all that paperwork. We can take those burdens off your plate." Her words dripped with sweetness, but her eyes gave her away. On the table sat a slice of quiche that trembled when I touched it with my fork. I set the utensil down. "What exactly do you want to take?" I asked. Linda's mouth tightened. "Oversight. We'll consolidate everything. Automatic transfers, accounts, bills. It's safer this way. Better for everyone." From across the table, Emily, my granddaughter, met my eyes. She had grown sharper in law school, her expression steady in a way that unsettled even Linda. She didn't speak until later, when we slipped into the kitchen together. "Grandma," she whispered, standing close enough for our shoulders to touch. "You still have every right. Don't let them bulldoze you." The words pulsed in my ears like a heartbeat. Back in the dining room, laughter rose too loud, as if to smother tension. I rinsed my coffee cup at the sink, dried it carefully, and returned to my chair. Linda scribbled figures on a yellow pad, outlining her plan. I waited until she finished, then asked, calm as a judge, "I'd like a copy of whatever you expect me to sign." The room went still. Even Paul's fork froze in midair. I smiled. The same smile I had used at bank counters and school board meetings, polite but unmovable. On Monday morning, I drove to the bank I had trusted since before Linda was old enough to drive. The lobby smelled of new envelopes and wintergreen polish. A young teller with a thin tie greeted me politely, though his eyes flickered with the nervous energy of someone who wondered if he should speak slower for my sake. "I need to cancel the automatic transfers going into my daughter's account," I said. He tapped his keyboard. "Of course, Ms. Hayes. I'll just need to see your ID." I slid my license across the counter. He studied the photo, then looked back at me with something like respect. "And your signature here," he added, turning the paper toward me. The pen felt solid in my hand. I wrote my name without a tremor. A satisfying scratch echoed in my ears, like the strike of a match. "Any penalties?" I asked. "No, ma'am," he said. "It's your account." From the bank, I drove across town to a small brick office tucked behind a maple tree already heavy with copper leaves. Inside, Attorney Naomi Porter shook my hand firmly. Her office smelled faintly of ink and lavender. She listened more than she spoke, her pen gliding only when I paused. "I want something simple," I told her. "A revocable trust. The house should go to my granddaughter, Emily. I want to keep control while I'm alive, but I don't want to be erased." She nodded, asked about contingencies, about healthcare directives, about who I trusted to make decisions if I could not. We discussed notaries and witnesses, documents stamped with authority so no one could argue later. Before I left, Naomi handed me a folder. "You might want to write a letter," she said. "Something personal to be read with the paperwork. Words carry weight that signatures can't." Driving home, I set the folder on the passenger seat. The late sun lit its edges gold, and it sat there like a patient companion. That evening, at my kitchen table, I opened a fresh page in Jim's notebook. My hand moved slow but steady as I began the letter. Each word felt like a stone I was setting in place, building a wall no one could topple. 2 weeks later, Mrs. Alvarez stopped me at the mailbox to chat about her roses. In the middle of our talk, she mentioned casually that Linda's firm was throwing a grand anniversary gala at the Valley Pines Country Club that Saturday. My name, of course, wasn't on any guest list. That evening, I ironed my navy dress, the one with simple lines that had never failed me, and polished the pearl studs Jim had given me on our 30th anniversary. I drove to the club just before dusk. The parking lot lamps were already buzzing, throwing circles of light on the asphalt. Inside, the lobby gleamed with marble floors. A young woman at the desk scanned a tablet. "Your name, ma'am?" she asked. "Margaret Hayes," I said. Her brow wrinkled, then softened. "You're not listed, but you're welcome to wait in the foyer if you like." Her whisper carried the kindness of someone sneaking bread to a stranger. I stood near a towering ficus, watching waiters glide in and out with trays of champagne. Through the wide doors, I saw Linda on stage in a scarlet dress that seemed to command the microphone. Her voice rolled smooth as she thanked the partners, the clients, the families who support us behind the scenes. I don't know if her eyes found me across the foyer, but when she lifted her glass high, I raised my chin. A woman beside me murmured about the spun sugar dessert, but I only pressed my hand against the letter folded safely in my purse, steadying my heartbeat. I did not cause a scene. That wasn't my style. What I wanted was presence, not spectacle. I wanted her to feel the weight of my existence without a single word shouted. When I stepped back outside, the night air smelled rinsed and clean, like it does after rain. I rolled the windows down on the drive home, letting the coolness soothe the heat under my skin. The porch light welcomed me like an old friend, steady and faithful. I paused on the steps before going inside, whispering to myself, "You are not invisible. Not yet. Not ever." The next morning, Emily showed up on my porch with grocery bags in her arms and lilac cuttings wrapped in damp paper towels. She pushed her glasses up her nose and grinned the way her grandfather used to when he'd bring home surprises. "I thought your fence could use some color," she said, dropping the bags on the counter. We brewed coffee and carried the cuttings outside. The air smelled of wet soil and fresh laundry drifting from a neighbor's line. We worked side by side along the fence, digging holes, pressing roots, tamping the earth. The dirt clung to my gloves like chocolate frosting. "Tell me about Grandpa," Emily said while patting down the soil. I laughed, remembering. Once he fixed the washing machine with nothing but a butter knife and a prayer. We had clean clothes by morning, though I never trusted that rattle until the day we replaced it. Emily laughed with me, a sound that carried across the yard. A mourning dove cooed from the gutter as if adding its own note. When the last cutting was in place, we sat on the porch steps, our boots streaked with mud. Across the street, a neighbor boy practiced his jump shot. He missed 5 in a row, then finally made one, shouting with such joy that his voice ran down the block like a thrown pebble, skipping across water. "Are you sure about all this?" Emily asked quietly. "Yes," I said, firm. "This isn't about punishing your mother. It's about leaving a map. A house is more than wood and shingles. It's a promise." She leaned her head against my shoulder. I watched the boy sink another shot and thought of the word beneficiary, how cold it looked on legal paper, and how warm it felt when it meant someone who listened, someone who understood. That evening, after Emily left, I rewrote my letter on heavy cream paper. I slid it into the folder Naomi had given me and locked it in the desk drawer, not because I doubted myself, but because even the strongest boundaries deserve hinges and keys. The morning of the signing. The sky stretched clean and blue, scrubbed by an overnight wind. I arrived at Naomi Porter's office early, clutching my leather notebook. The blinds cut the sunlight into neat ladders across the carpet. I sat down, steadying my breath, waiting. Linda swept in 5 minutes late, Paul right behind her. They looked like they were arriving at a photo shoot, pressed suits, polished shoes, faces composed. Naomi greeted them calmly, then outlined the agenda as if she were listing groceries. Her even tone settled the air, though I felt Linda's glance scrape across me like sandpaper. We went through the documents one by one, the trust, the will, the directives. Naomi pointed to each place I should initial, and I did so with a steady hand. Linda smiled, thin and brittle as porcelain, each time I signed. Then Naomi lifted the letter. "Would you like to read this yourself?" she asked me gently. "Or shall I?" My throat tightened. I nodded for her to read. She unfolded the paper. Her voice was plain, uncolored, but it filled the room. "Respect isn't a gift you hand your mother," it began. "It's the roof she built over your head, the meals she placed on your plate, and the love she never withdrew even when you did." The words hung heavy, impossible to dodge. She read on about dignity, how it disappears only when others decide they can take it. She read that I wanted my home to go to the one who made space for my voice, who listened without trying to manage me. She read that love and control are cousins who should never share a roof. Paul looked down at his folded hands. Emily sat upright, her eyes bright but steady. Linda made a sound like a door hinge in need of oil. When Naomi finished, silence covered the room. Outside, a truck downshifted and rolled away. "I don't agree," Linda said at last. "You don't have to," I answered, my voice low but firm. "You only have to hear me." Naomi stamped the final page with her notary's seal. The sharp sound rang through me like a bell, small but undeniable. The weeks that followed felt different, as though the house itself had released a long, quiet breath. Morning sunlight stretched farther across the living room rug, making the colors in the fabric look brighter than I remembered. The silence inside was no longer heavy. It was gentle, like a blanket tucked around me. I still opened Jim's leather notebook each morning, but the pages now filled more with grocery lists and planting notes than with strategies for survival. Miss Alvarez knocked one Thursday afternoon carrying zucchini bread wrapped in a striped towel. She set it on my counter and launched into a long story about her sister's hip replacement, complete with the hospital drama and the triumph of walking again. We sat at my kitchen table, sipping tea while the bread cooled. I laughed more than I expected, and when she left, I realized I hadn't once thought about defending myself or my choices. It felt good to simply be a neighbor again. Emily made it a routine to stop by every Wednesday. She would water the lilacs, check their progress, then stay for supper. Their stems had taken root, small buds showing against the fence like promises waiting for spring. We ate simple meals, chicken stew, cornbread, sometimes just sandwiches with chips, and we talked about her classes, her professors, her hopes for after graduation. She didn't push me to talk about Linda, but her listening presence told me I could if I wanted. That quiet understanding was more comfort than any advice. One evening the phone rang, and when I picked up, Linda's voice was careful, deliberate. "Would you reconsider the allocations?" she asked. I breathed slowly before answering. "I'll reconsider the tone of our conversations. Linda, that seems more urgent." Silence pressed on the line. For a moment I thought she had hung up. Then she exhaled, almost like a sob she didn't want me to hear. "Okay," she said, barely more than a whisper. It wasn't surrender. It wasn't even peace, but it was an absence of war, and that counted for something. On Sunday, I drove out to the reservoir. Jim and I had spent countless evenings there watching herons rise from the reeds, their wings stretching wide against the fading sky. Families picnicked nearby that day. I watched a father teaching his son to launch a plastic kite. The boy stumbled, ran, and finally got it airborne. His shout of triumph carried across the water. I smiled, thinking of the letter I had written, the truths I had needed to carve in ink so they couldn't be erased. Back home, I made tea and cracked the kitchen window just enough to hear the neighbors' wind chimes. I opened Jim's notebook and wrote one plain line. Dignity isn't something you win. It's something you keep an eye on, every day. The words sat steady on the page. Plain words, but true ones. On the first warm evening of May, Emily and I carried supper out to the porch. The air smelled of cut grass and charcoal drifting from a neighbor's grill. We spread a quilt over the table and set out chicken salad, sliced peaches, and a pitcher of iced tea that left wet rings on the wood. The lilacs along the fence had begun to bloom, their purple clusters heavy, bending the stems toward us like they wanted to join the meal. We ate slowly, not because the food demanded it, but because the quiet felt like something worth savoring. Emily told me about a professor who had challenged her to think about justice not as punishment, but as balance. I nodded, listening, proud of the woman she was becoming. I still love your mother, I said at last, surprising even myself with how easily the words came. But loving her doesn't mean handing her the keys to my life. Emily set down her fork, her eyes searching mine. I know. Grandma, you've shown me that boundaries aren't walls. They're lines that tell people where respect begins. We sat together as the sun dipped lower. Across the street, porch lights winked on one by one. A boy rolled past on a skateboard, wheels whispering on the asphalt. Far off, a freight train rumbled, loosening the evening air. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the rhythm of it all. The train, the skateboard, the heartbeat of a neighborhood settling into night. When the porch light clicked on above us, I thought of Linda at her own dinner table somewhere across town. I imagined her staring at her plate, hearing echoes of words she hadn't wanted to hear, words that would not fade no matter how tightly she tried to close her hands around control. I sent her a quiet wish, not for remorse, but for understanding. After Emily left, I rinsed the plates at the sink. Water hissed against porcelain, steam fogging the window. I left the dishes to dry like pale moons on the counter. Before bed, I checked the front door twice, not from fear, but from habit, a small ritual of care Jim and I had practiced all our lives. I walked through each room, switching off lamps, the living room, the hallway. Finally, the bedroom. Each darkened space felt like a promise kept. I paused at the desk, touching the locked drawer that held my letter and the signed papers. They no longer felt like weapons. They felt like anchors, keeping me steady. Climbing into bed, I whispered goodnight to the house, the way I always had. My name, written where it belonged, rested in my chest like a heartbeat. Sleep came easy, soft as lilac petals falling in the night. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these family drama and revenge stories, please subscribe and join me for more every day.